Alright, let's talk about one of the most distinctive voices of the British Empire, Rudyard Kipling. Kipling was born in Bombay in 1865, and that birth year and place have both been asked in exam. His father was a British official serving in India, so Kipling grew up surrounded by the sights and sounds of colonial India, something that would shape all his later writing. He was sent to school in Devonshire, England. But life there wasn't easy. He originally wanted to join the army, but his poor eyesight kept him out. So instead, he returned to India and began working as a journalist. He joined the Lahore Civil and Military Gazette, and later, the Pioneer. Both papers gave him a front row seat to British Indian life. Kipling began publishing short stories while still in his early 20s, and they quickly made him famous around the world. His collection, Plain Tales from the Hills, published in 1887, captured the rhythms, wit, and moral ironies of Anglo-Indian society, and yes, that title has been asked in exam. The following year came Soldiers 3, 1888, a brilliant series of stories about British soldiers in India, equally famous and again exam relevant. Kipling had a genius for short stories, sharp, vivid, and economical. His style was direct, his tone often self-assured, sometimes even cocky, but always intensely visual. Few writers could sketch a scene or a character with such quick precision. Now, when it came to novels, his success was mixed. His early novel, The Light That Failed, 1891, was a disappointment. That failure has been asked in exam, but a decade later he redeemed himself with Kim, 1901, a novel full of color, movement, and observation. Set in colonial India, Kim follows a young boy who becomes a spy during the Great Game, and it's considered one of his greatest works. But Kipling's true magic lives in his children's writing. His two masterpieces, The Jungle Books, 1894 and 1895, gave us timeless characters like Mowgli, Balu, Bagheera, and Sher Khan. These stories, full of adventure and moral wisdom, are still read and loved today, and yes, both books have been asked in exam. Kipling also wrote poetry vigorous, rhythmic, and patriotic. He became the poet of the British Army and of imperialism. During the South African War, 1899 to 1902, he wrote poems that glorified duty and courage. Yet, in some of his verses, you'll also find a deeper, more reflective voice. Take his poem, Mandalay. For instance, it's filled with emotion and humanity beneath the surface of empire. Or Recessional, 1897, which reveals a poet questioning imperial pride and reminding his readers of humility before God. That poem, by the way, is a frequent exam question and shows Kipling's true poetic greatness. In 1907, Kipling became the first English writer to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, another key fact for exam. He was only 42, making him one of the youngest Nobel laureates ever. In his later years, Kipling's popularity declined a bit. His imperial themes felt outdated as the world changed, but his craft never lost its brilliance. He lived his final years in England, passing away in 1936. So to sum up, Kipling was born in Bombay 1865, wrote Plain Tales from the Hills, Soldiers 3, Kim and the Jungle Books, won the Nobel Prize in 1907, and remains the great storyteller of empire and childhood alike. His poems Mandalay and Recessional show that behind the imperial pride was a poet deeply aware of human fragility. Kipling's career is fascinating because he wrote everything: short stories, poems, novels, children's tales, travel sketches, even war journalism. Let's explore his major works in a way that'll stick in your memory and help you score full marks in exam. He began young with schoolboy lyrics in 1881, but his literary breakthrough came a few years later with departmental ditties in 1886, a collection of satirical verses about British colonial life in India. Around the same time, he published Plain Tales from the Hills in 1888, a brilliant series of short stories that captured Anglo-Indian society with humor and irony. That same year, 1888, was incredibly productive for Kipling. He published Soldiers 3, the story of the Gadsbys, in black and white, Under the Deodars, The Phantom, Rickshaw and Other Eerie Tales, and Wee Willie Winkie and Other Child Stories. Each of these came out in the same 12-month burst. And yes, two of them, Wee Willie Winkie and The Phantom Rickshaw, have been directly asked in exam. The latter even includes the famous story The Man Who Would Be King, another important exam reference. Then came Barrack Room Ballads in 1892, which made Kipling's poetry famous worldwide. These ballads gave voice to ordinary British soldiers in India, using the rhythms of music hall speech. Poems like Ganga Deen come from this collection, and both titles are regular exam favorites. In 1894, Kipling gave the world something truly magical, The Jungle Book, followed by The Second Jungle Book a year later. Together, they include 14 stories and poems, including Mowgli's Brothers, Kaa's Hunting, Rikki Tikki Tavi, and Tumai of the Elephants. Every one of those titles has been asked in exam at some point, so keep them handy. And don't forget the songs inside, like Darzy's Chant and the Road Song of the Bandar Log. After that, Kipling's career kept expanding. His adventure novel, The Light That Failed, appeared in 1891, followed by The Naulaka in 1892, co-written with Walcott Balestier. Then came Captains Courageous in 1896, and of course his masterpiece, Kim, in 1901, a dazzling spy novel set along the Great Trunk Road of India. Both Captains Courageous and Kim are must-know exam titles. He also published travel essays like From Sea to Sea 1899 and short story collections like The Day's Work 1898, Many Inventions 1893 and Traffics and Discoveries 1904. Each of those is worth remembering because The Day's Work, Traffics and Discoveries and Many Inventions are all frequent exam picks. Speaking of traffics and discoveries, here's a small set of stories that have been tested. Wireless, where a dying man unconsciously channels Keats's Eve of St. Agnes and Mrs. Bathurst, which is set in South Africa. It was recently asked in exam. Both are examples of Kipling's eerie, modern side. And of course, don't forget his poetry collections, Barrack Room Ballads, 1890, The Seven Seas, 1896, and The Five Nations, 1903, all have appeared in exam questions. Later came Songs from Books, 1912, and The Years Between, 1919. Among his children's classics are Just So Stories for Little Children, 1902, and Puck of Pook's Hill, 1906, which blend history and folklore, both delightful and exam important. And then there's the controversial poem, The White Man's Burden, The United States and the Philippine Islands, written in 1899, a political piece that's been repeatedly asked in exam for its colonial theme. To wrap up, here's a quick memory anchor for the most examined titles. The Man Who Would Be King, Kim, Rikki Tikki Tavi, Wee Willie Winkie, The White Man's Burden, Barrack Room Ballads, The Light That Failed, Puck of Pook's Hill, The Day's Work, The Phantom Rickshaw, The Last Sati. Kipling's writing captures empire, childhood, courage and fear, all in crisp, rhythmic English that's both moral and magical. Alright, let's talk about Rudyard Kipling, one of the defining literary voices of the British Empire and one of the most quoted writers of the late 19th century. We'll start with The Man Who Would Be King, first published in the Phantom Rickshaw collection in 1888, that's a key exam detail, and later included in Wee Willie Winkie in 1895. It's a gripping story of two British adventurers in India, Daniel Dravot and Piche Carnehan, both charming, reckless, and ambitious. They dream of becoming kings in a remote land called Kafiristan, located in present-day Afghanistan. That setting Kafiristan is another point often asked in exam. Their plan is wild. They'll travel into the mountains, pose as gods, and rule over the local tribes. At first, it actually works. The locals worship them, their kingdom grows, and they start to believe in their own divinity. But things fall apart when Dravo tries to marry a local woman, revealing that he is mortal. The illusion of godhood shatters. Dravot is captured and executed, while Carnahan is tortured and left broken, wandering back into India, carrying the haunting memory of their downfall. The story ends with that unforgettable line when the narrator meets a scarred and delirious Piche Carnahan who whispers, "I was king once," a line that has been asked in exam multiple times. It's a story of greed, pride, and the collapse of imperial ambition, and one of Kipling's most powerful moral fables. Now, let's move to Kipling's other masterpiece, The Jungle Book, published in 1894. This collection of stories, set in the Indian forests around Sivni, brings together human and animal worlds in a way that's both magical and symbolic. The central figure is Mowgli, a human boy raised by wolves, mentored by Balu, the bear, and Bagheera, the panther, and constantly hunted by the fierce tiger Sher Khan. And yes, Sher Khan name has been asked in exam. But here's what's fascinating. These stories aren't really about animals, they're about law, order, and belonging. The law of the jungle stands for discipline, balance, and respect, lessons that reflect Kipling's lifelong interest in authority and duty. Each story explores different sides of survival and morality. For instance, Rikki Tikki Tavi, another exam favorite, tells the story of a brave mongoose who protects a human family from cobras. And behind the adventure, Kipling weaves themes of freedom, loyalty, and identity. Even though The Jungle Book is full of animals, it's deeply human at heart. It shows what it means to find your place, whether in a pack, a tribe, or a family. It also reflects Kipling's own childhood feelings of displacement, having spent years away from India as a boy. So, to wrap up, The Man Who Would Be King gives us ambition, adventure, and tragedy at the edges of empire, while The Jungle Book offers timeless lessons about belonging, law, and freedom. Both works prove that Kipling wasn't just writing stories, he was exploring the human condition through myth, morality, and the wildness of the world itself. Alright, let's start with the poem that made headlines across the world. Kipling wrote The White Man's Burden in 1899, addressing the Philippine-American War, and yes, that's been asked in exam. The poem was essentially advice to the United States as it prepared to take colonial control over the Philippines. Interestingly, it wasn't originally meant for America at all. Kipling first wrote it for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, but later replaced it with his more somber poem Recessional, published in 1897, another key exam fact. So what does the burden mean here? Kipling presents empire as a moral duty, the idea that Western nations, especially Britain and now America, had a responsibility to civilize non-Western peoples. This idea of civilizing mission, sometimes called the mission of civilization, was often used to justify imperial conquest. The phrase white man's burden itself has become shorthand for this colonial ideology, and that's definitely one to remember for exam. The poem's tone is both commanding and cautionary. It tells the colonizer to take up the white man's burden, but also warns that the task will bring thankless toil and savage wars of peace. That phrase, savage wars of peace, appears in line 17 and has been asked in exam. Kipling also refers to colonized peoples as half devil and half child in line 8, another frequently tested line. So, while the poem pretends to offer noble advice, it's also a chilling reflection of Western superiority. It embodies the imperialist mindset, paternalistic, patronizing, and convinced of its own virtue. Critics today see it as the poetic face of manifest destiny, that 19th century belief that white nations were destined to rule others. In short, the white man's burden turns imperialism into a moral enterprise, and that tension between noble rhetoric and harsh reality makes it one of the most discussed political poems of the modern age. Now, just 2 years later, Kipling published his most famous novel, Kim, in 1901, and it feels completely different in tone, though empire still beats at its heart. The story follows Kimball O'Hara, nicknamed Kim, an Irish orphan growing up in the bustling streets of Lahore, and yes, that detail has been asked in exam. Kim survives by his quick wit and endless curiosity until one day he meets a Tibetan Lama who is searching for a sacred river of purification. Kim, fascinated by this spiritual quest, becomes his disciple, another fact you'll want to remember for exam. But here's where the story gets layered. While traveling with the Lama, Kim meets Mahbub Ali, a horse trader who also happens to be a British spy, and that connection between Mahbub Ali and British intelligence is an important exam point. Impressed by Kim's cleverness, the British recruit him into the Great Game, the geopolitical struggle between Britain and Russia for control of Central Asia. Kim is then sent to a British school under Colonel Creighton's supervision, where he learns the art of espionage. But the real story isn't just about spying, it's about identity. Kim straddles two worlds, the colorful, spiritual life of India he loves, and the disciplined, secretive world of British intelligence. That internal conflict between loyalty to empire and loyalty to the soul defines his journey. Kim is both a spy adventure and a spiritual pilgrimage. Through Kim's eyes, Kipling paints a vivid picture of colonial India, crowded bazaars, monks on dusty roads, soldiers, fakirs and mystics all living under the British Raj. The novel's charm lies in its colorful detail and affection for Indian life, even while it reflects the hierarchies of empire. By the end, Kim must decide who he truly is, a servant of the British Empire or a seeker of spiritual truth. That tension gives the novel its enduring power. So, here's how to remember it. The White Man's Burden, written in 1899, about America's new imperial responsibility in the Philippines. Kim, published in 1901, a vivid adventure set in colonial India, exploring the double life of empire and identity. Together, these works capture the two faces of Kipling, the imperial spokesman urging civilization through conquest, and the storyteller deeply fascinated by the people and lands under empire's rule. Even today, The White Man's Burden reminds us how language can disguise power as morality, while Kim reminds us that empire was never just political, it was also deeply personal. We'll begin with one of his most magical works, Puck of Pook's Hill, published in 1906. Now, what makes this book fascinating is that it blends fantasy with English history. It's a collection of stories set in the countryside of Sussex near Kipling's own home called Bateman's in the High Weald, and that exact location has been asked in exam. The stories revolve around two children, Dan and Una, who accidentally summon Puck, the mischievous fairy from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Puck calls himself the oldest old thing in England, a phrase that's come up in exam multiple times. He's the last of the fairies, a bridge between the mythical and the historical. Each story follows a simple pattern. Puck appears, tells a tale, or brings someone from England's past to tell it, and then disappears, leaving the children wiser. You meet characters like Sir Richard Dalingridge, a Norman knight who speaks of battle and honor, Hugh the Saxon, who recalls Viking raids and loyalty, and old Hobden, the hedge cutter who knows the land secrets. The stories cover everything from Roman Britain to medieval England, blending myth, folklore, and history into what we might call historical fantasy today. Each tale is framed by a poem that captures its theme. One famous line that students must remember is, "For to admire and for to see, for to behold the world so wide." That too has been asked in exam. So Puck of Pook's Hill isn't just a children's book. It's a love letter to England's past, a magical reminder that the land itself holds memory and mystery. Now, a few years later, Kipling wrote something very different but equally powerful, the poem, If, first published in 1910 in his collection Rewards and Fairies. Interestingly, that's the same book that includes the story Brother Square Toes, where the poem appears as a father's advice to his son, and that connection has been directly asked in exam. Kipling actually wrote If around 1895, inspired by Leander Starr Jameson, the man behind the failed Jameson raid in South Africa. The poem celebrates Victorian Stoicism, the idea of self-control, endurance, and calm strength in the face of chaos. The voice of the poem is deeply personal. It's a father speaking to his son, teaching him how to live with honor. Remember, every stanza gives practical life lessons. Keep your head when all about you are losing theirs. Stay calm under pressure. Dream, but not make dreams your master. Don't let ambition blind you. Hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on, keep going, even when your spirit is tired. Walk with kings, nor lose the common touch. Remain humble, no matter your success. And finally, that last line, one of the most quoted in all of English poetry. Yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son. It's not just a line, it's a creed. It sums up the Victorian ideal of manhood, courage, patience, humility, and moral balance. Kipling's If has been called a manual for integrity, and it's one of those poems that appear in exams again and again because it captures the essence of an age, moral endurance dressed in poetry. So together, Puck of Pook's Hill and If show two sides of Kipling. The storyteller who reawakens England's ancient past through myth and history, and the philosopher-poet who turns life's lessons into timeless verse. Both remind us that imagination and discipline, wonder and wisdom are what make a culture truly enduring.